I handed my daughter-in-law a century-old sapphire brooch, a priceless family heirloom, only for her to list it on eBay before the dinner plates were even cleared. Even now, saying those words out loud makes my chest feel heavy. That brooch was never just jewelry to me. It belonged to my grandmother Eleanor. She carried it through years of hardship, wrapped carefully inside a cloth pouch while the world around her changed. Every woman in our family protected it like a piece of our own heart. That evening was supposed to be special. The dining room glowed with candlelight. Rain tapped softly against the windows while my family laughed around the table. I truly believed I was passing something meaningful into loving hands. But halfway through dinner, I noticed my daughter-in-law slipping away to the hallway again and again, her phone glowing in her hand. A few minutes later, my nephew quietly leaned toward me and whispered, "Aunt May, I think you need to see this." My hands trembled when I opened the link he sent. There it was, my grandmother's sapphire brooch, listed online for auction, and the bidding had already begun. Before I continue, I just want to welcome you warmly, wherever you may be listening from tonight. Maybe you're resting after a long day, sitting quietly with a cup of tea, or simply looking for a story that reminds you that none of us carry life's burdens alone. I'm truly grateful you're here with me, and if stories like this touch your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows gentle stories like mine to keep reaching people who may need comfort, understanding, or even just a quiet voice in the dark. My name is Margaret, though most people in my family simply call me May. I've lived in the same old house for nearly 40 years now. Since my husband passed, the home has become quieter. Some evenings, the silence feels peaceful. Other evenings, it feels much too large. Family has always meant everything to me. Not money, not status, just family. Memories shared around dinner tables, old recipes passed down by hand, little traditions that survive long after people are gone. That is why what happened that night hurt far more than anyone could imagine. The morning of the dinner arrived with soft rain and heavy thoughts. I woke before sunrise, long before the rest of the neighborhood began moving. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. In the kitchen, for a few minutes, I simply sat at the edge of my bed staring at the window while rain slid slowly down the glass. Something about that day felt important. Not joyful exactly, just important. I wrapped my sweater around my shoulders and walked downstairs carefully, holding the railing the way I always did after my knees started bothering me a few winters ago. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from the bread I baked the night before. I tied my grandmother Eleanor's old apron around my waist and began preparing dinner. Cooking had always calmed me. Chopping vegetables, stirring soup slowly, folding dough with my hands. These little routines made life feel steady, even when emotions were not. While peeling potatoes, my eyes drifted toward the wooden cabinet near the dining room wall. Inside rested the sapphire brooch. Even after all these years, I rarely opened that cabinet without pausing first. The brooch had belonged to my grandmother, and before her, to her mother. Every woman in our family treated it with care that went beyond ordinary jewelry. It was part of our history, part of our identity. I still remembered being 10 years old and watching my grandmother pin it carefully onto her dress before Christmas dinner. One day, she told me softly, "This will belong to someone who understands what family means." At the time, I thought she was only talking about tradition. Now I understood she meant something much deeper. By afternoon, the house slowly transformed into the kind of warm family gathering I used to love so much. Candles waited along the center of the dining table. The silverware shined under the soft yellow light above the room. I placed folded napkins beside each plate while gentle piano music played quietly from the radio. Outside, the rain continued steadily. Inside, everything felt warm. At least for a little while. Daniel arrived first. My son stepped through the front door carrying wine bottles in one hand while shaking rainwater from his coat with the other. "Mom, it smells incredible in here," he said, with a tired smile. I kissed his cheek. "You always say that, because it's always true." But when I looked closely at him, I noticed the exhaustion behind his eyes again. Daniel had always been gentle by nature. Even as a child, he hated conflict. He wanted everyone around him to feel comfortable all the time. Sometimes that kindness became a weakness. A few moments later, Vanessa entered behind him. She looked beautiful that evening. Her long cream-colored sweater matched the pearl earrings she wore, and her makeup looked flawless even in the soft kitchen lighting. Vanessa always carried herself with confidence. She knew how to make good impressions. She hugged me warmly. "May, this house feels so cozy," she said. "That's the rain helping." I replied with a smile. At first, everything felt perfectly normal. The grandchildren soon filled the hallway with laughter and wet shoes. My sister Helen arrived carrying flowers from her garden. My nephew Thomas brought dessert from the bakery downtown. Slowly, the house came alive with voices and movement. For a while, I forgot the nervous feeling sitting quietly inside my chest. Dinner began beautifully. Steam rose from the roast while dishes passed carefully around the table. Helen told old family stories that made everyone laugh. Thomas teased Daniel about his terrible driving. Even the grandchildren sat unusually still while eating pie. And Vanessa? Vanessa smiled through all of it. She complimented the food repeatedly, asked polite questions, reached for Daniel's hand every now and then. But I noticed something else too. Her phone never seemed to leave her side. Every few minutes, the screen lit up beneath the table. Every few minutes, her attention drifted away from the conversation. At first, I told myself not to think much about it. Younger people live through their phones now. That was simply how the world worked. Still, I noticed, after dinner plates were mostly cleared away, I felt my heartbeat begin to rise. It was time. I stood slowly from my chair. "There's something I'd like to give Vanessa tonight," I said, softly. The room became quiet immediately. Daniel looked surprised. Vanessa straightened in her seat. "Oh," she said with a smile. My hands suddenly felt cold. For one brief second, I considered sitting back down and pretending I had changed my mind. But instead, I walked toward the cabinet. The brass key turned softly in the lock. I carefully removed the velvet box resting inside. Even holding it made me emotional. The edges of the dark blue velvet had faded with age, and tiny scratches marked the surface from decades of careful handling. My grandmother's initials were still pressed faintly into the bottom. E.M. Eleanor May. I carried the box back to the table slowly. Everyone watched silently. When I sat down again, I rested the box gently in front of Vanessa. "This belonged to my grandmother," I began quietly, "and before her, it belonged to her mother." The room remained completely still. When I was a little girl, she told me this brooch should only be passed to someone who protects the family with love. I opened the box carefully. The sapphire caught the candlelight instantly. Tiny diamonds surrounded the deep blue stone, resting inside delicate silver work crafted entirely by hand. Even after 100 years, it still looked timeless. Helen covered her mouth softly. "Oh, May!" The grandchildren leaned closer with wide eyes. Vanessa stared down at it silently for a moment. "It's beautiful," she whispered. And it truly was. Not because it looked expensive, because it carried memory. I remembered my grandmother wearing it during weddings and holidays. I remembered watching her remove it carefully before bedtime, wrapping it gently inside cloth like something sacred. That brooch had survived wars, poverty, heartbreak, and generations of change. Now it sat in front of Vanessa. I looked directly at her. This heirloom has always stayed with the women trusted to carry this family forward. For a moment, her expression softened. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "This must be worth quite a lot now, right?" The room became painfully quiet. It was not what she said. It was how quickly she said it. Before emotion, before gratitude, before understanding, money had entered her mind first. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Helen lowered her eyes. I forced a small smile. "It's valuable to our family," I answered gently. Vanessa laughed lightly. "Oh, of course. I only meant financially. Nobody responded. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while silence settled over the table for a few awkward seconds. Then Daniel quickly changed the subject. The craftsmanship is amazing, he said. Yes, I whispered. It is. I handed the brooch carefully toward Vanessa. For the smallest moment, hesitation gripped my chest. Something inside me whispered not yet, but then she smiled warmly again, and I let go. Thank you, May, she said while taking the brooch into her hands. She immediately turned it over, examining the clasp and sapphire closely, not emotionally, carefully, like someone studying value. I noticed it instantly, and once you notice something like that, it becomes impossible to unsee. Dessert arrived a few minutes later, and conversation slowly returned around the table. Coffee was poured, pie slices passed from hand to hand. Then Vanessa suddenly stood. I'll be right back, she said casually while holding her phone. No one reacted at first. I watched her disappear down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. 5 minutes passed. Then, several more. Finally, Daniel called softly, "Everything okay?" "Just touching up my makeup," she answered from down the hall. When she returned, the brooch was pinned neatly onto her sweater, but something about it felt wrong, like it did not belong there. She sat down and immediately checked her phone again. Beneath the table, a small smile crossed her face. Then another. Not emotional smiles, excited ones. My stomach tightened quietly. Thomas continued telling a story across the table, but I barely heard him anymore. My attention stayed fixed on Vanessa's glowing phone screen. Then Thomas's own phone buzzed beside his coffee cup. He glanced down absent-mindedly at first. Suddenly his expression changed. Confusion. Then disbelief. Slowly, he looked toward me. "Aunt May," he whispered carefully. My heart immediately sank. He stood and walked beside my chair before turning the phone toward me. "I think you should see this." My hands trembled as I looked down. And there it was, the sapphire brooch, my grandmother's brooch, photographed against a plain white background, listed online for auction. The title read, "Vintage Sapphire Brooch Estate Jewelry Quick Sale." Quick sale. Those words hit me harder than I can explain. Not family history. Not cherished heirloom. Just another object being sold to strangers, and the auction timer had already begun counting down. Slowly, I lifted my eyes toward Vanessa. She sat, smiling at her phone, completely unaware that I now knew exactly what she had done. For a few seconds, I could not breathe properly. The room around me blurred softly while Thomas held the phone beside my plate. I stared at the screen, hoping with all my heart that I had misunderstood somehow. Maybe it was a similar brooch. Maybe the lighting only made it look the same, but deep inside, I already knew the truth. Nobody else in the world could have taken those photographs within the last 20 minutes. The sapphire rested against the exact white napkin Vanessa had used beside her dessert plate. Even the tiny scratch near the silver clasp was visible under the bright camera flash. It was ours. No. It was hers now. Technically. At least that was probably how she saw it. A gift. An object, something to sell. My chest tightened painfully. Thomas lowered the brightness on his phone so nobody else at the table would notice. "Aunt May," he whispered carefully, "what do you want to do?" I could barely answer. The listing stayed open in front of me while the auction timer slowly counted down second by second. 3 days remaining. Current bid. 1,200. My grandmother's life reduced to numbers on a screen. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look back toward the table. Vanessa was laughing softly at something Helen had just said. She held her wine glass delicately in one hand while her phone rested face down beside her plate, calm, relaxed, untouched by guilt, and somehow that hurt even more. Daniel noticed my expression immediately. "You all right, Mom?" I looked at him for a moment. My son, The little boy who once cried for an entire afternoon after accidentally breaking a birdhouse his father built. So gentle. So trusting. I wondered if he had any idea who he was sitting beside. I'm fine, I lied softly. He nodded, though he still looked concerned. Thomas quietly stepped away and returned to his seat without another word. Neither of us wanted to create a scene in front of the children. Not yet. I folded my hands carefully in my lap to stop them from shaking. Inside my chest, heartbreak moved slowly like cold water. What hurt most was not the money. It was the speed of it, the carelessness. Vanessa had not even waited until dinner ended, not even long enough to pretend the brooch meant something to her. She had accepted over 100 years of family history with one hand while preparing to sell it with the other. Helen reached for another slice of pie and smiled toward me. This dinner feels like old times, she said warmly. I forced a smile back. Yes, I whispered, old times. Meanwhile, my eyes drifted again toward Vanessa's phone. The screen lit briefly. Her face brightened instantly. Another bid notification, even from across the table. I recognized the excitement in her expression. I suddenly remembered dozens of little moments from the past few years, comments I ignored at the time, questions that seemed harmless. How much do antique rings usually sell for? Do old family items appreciate over time? You should really insure some of the things in this house. Back then, I told myself she was only curious. Now those memories felt different, sharper. I looked toward the hallway where family photographs covered the walls. Pictures of weddings, graduations, Christmas mornings. My late husband smiling beside Daniel when he was still small enough to sit on his shoulders. Every photograph represented time, love, patience, sacrifice. And now a piece of that history was sitting online beside used watches and discount handbags. The thought nearly broke me. Vanessa stood again a few minutes later. I'll just be a second, she said casually while picking up her phone. This time, I watched her carefully. She moved quickly down the hallway, glancing around once before disappearing into the kitchen doorway. Thomas noticed too. He quietly leaned toward me. She's checking the auction, he whispered. I nodded slowly. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately. I imagined placing the phone on the table for everyone to see. I imagined asking calmly why. But another part of me stopped that impulse. Not because I wanted to protect Vanessa, because I wanted the truth fully exposed. Anger creates noise, silence reveals character. So I stayed quiet. A few moments later, Daniel stood from his chair. I'll help with coffee, he said before walking toward the kitchen. My heart tightened instantly. I wondered if he would see something, hear something, but less than a minute later, he returned carrying mugs while Vanessa followed behind him smiling naturally. If he noticed anything unusual, he gave no sign of it. The grandchildren soon drifted into the living room to watch television, leaving only the adults at the table now. The atmosphere grew calmer, quieter. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Helen spoke about her garden. Thomas discussed work. And through it all, Vanessa kept checking the auction. Each notification seemed to feed something inside her. Excitement. Greed. Maybe both. Finally, Thomas slid his phone toward me beneath the tablecloth again. The bids had climbed higher. 1800, then $2,100 only minutes later. The listing description remained painfully cold. Estate jewelry, vintage sapphire brooch. Excellent. Resale condition. Resale condition. Not treasured. Not loved. Resale. I stared at those words while memories flooded through my mind. I saw my grandmother sitting beside the fireplace during winter, polishing the sapphire gently with a soft cloth. I saw my mother wearing it at my wedding. I remembered hiding it inside a flour tin during a burglary scare decades ago because we feared losing it, and now strangers online were competing to own it, without knowing any of its story. A deep sadness settled over me then. Not dramatic sadness. quiet sadness, the kind that drains warmth from your chest slowly. Thomas lowered his voice again. We can report the listing, he whispered. I shook my head gently. No, you don't want it removed? I want to understand. He frowned slightly. She's selling your family heirloom during dinner, I know. Then why wait? Because some moments change families forever, I thought, and when spoken aloud, certain truths can never be gathered back. I needed to think carefully. I looked toward Daniel again. He was smiling faintly while speaking to Helen, completely unaware that his marriage was quietly cracking apart only a few feet away. The sight hurt more than anything else that night. Vanessa suddenly leaned toward him. Can you believe antique jewelry sells for so much these days? She asked casually. My stomach dropped. Daniel shrugged lightly. I guess collectors buy anything. She laughed softly. I'm serious. Some people make thousands from estate pieces. Estate pieces. That was how she saw it. Not family. Inventory. I lowered my eyes before anyone noticed the pain in my expression. For a while, nobody spoke directly to me. I think they sensed something had changed, even if they did not understand what. Then Helen touched my arm gently. You all right, May? You look pale. I forced another smile. Just tired. The truth was, exhaustion had suddenly reached somewhere deeper than my body. I excused myself quietly and walked toward the hallway. The moment I turned the corner, I pressed one hand against the wall to steady myself. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror near the staircase, older than I felt an hour earlier. Sadder too. I reached into my sweater pocket and pulled out my phone. For several seconds, I simply stared at Arthur Bennett's name in my contacts. Arthur had been my husband's closest friend for over 40 years. A retired jeweler. Careful, quiet, loyal beyond words. If anyone understood what that brooch truly meant, it was Arthur. Finally, I called him. He answered after the second ring. Well, this is a surprise, he said warmly. I stepped farther down the hallway so nobody would overhear. Arthur, I whispered, my voice shaking slightly. I need your help. Silence filled the line immediately. What happened? I closed my eyes briefly. She's selling it. Arthur understood instantly. The sapphire? Yes. A long pause followed. Then his voice became calm and steady. Tell me everything. I explained quickly while staring toward the dining room where soft laughter still drifted through the house like nothing had changed. Arthur listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he sighed heavily. That brooch survived 2 world wars only to end up on an auction site during dessert. He murmured sadly, tears burned behind my eyes. I don't know what to do. Yes, you do, he replied gently. I wiped my face carefully before anyone could see. What do you mean? We protect it. His voice remained calm, certain. Listen to me carefully, May. Do not confront her tonight. I frowned slightly. Why not? Because right now she thinks she's clever. Let her keep thinking that. I looked back toward the dining room. Vanessa's laughter floated through the hallway again. Arthur continued softly. Send me the auction link. You're going to bid on it? No, he said quietly. Then after a small pause, I'm going to buy it back. A strange stillness settled inside me then. Not relief exactly. Something colder. More focused. I realized at that moment this was no longer simply about recovering jewelry. It was about revealing truth. Arthur spoke again before hanging up. Some lessons arrive loudly, May. Others arrive quietly at the perfect moment. I glanced back toward the dining room one more time. Vanessa sat smiling at her glowing phone screen, still completely unaware that someone else was now watching the auction. 2. After my call with Arthur, I stood alone in the hallway for a few quiet moments, trying to steady myself before returning to the dining room. Rain still whispered against the windows. Somewhere in the living room, the grandchildren laughed at a television show. Ordinary sounds, peaceful sounds, Yet everything inside me had changed. Just half an hour earlier, I believed I was passing a piece of my family into loving hands. Now I stood there realizing I had handed it to someone already calculating how quickly she could turn it into cash. I pressed my fingers gently against my forehead and took a slow breath. Then I walked back to the table. Vanessa looked up immediately. "There you are," she said brightly. "We thought you disappeared." I smiled softly and returned to my chair. "Just needed a moment." She nodded while reaching for her wine glass again. But even as she spoke to Helen, her eyes kept drifting toward her phone resting beside her plate, waiting, watching, hoping for another bid. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you see it clearly, every small movement begins to look different. Her smiles no longer felt warm to me. Her laughter sounded practiced. Even the way she touched a sapphire brooch pinned to her sweater seemed possessive rather than sentimental. Thomas quietly glanced toward me from across the table. I could tell he was waiting for some sign that I planned to confront her. Instead, I reached calmly for my coffee. Arthur's words repeated in my mind. "Let her keep thinking she's clever." A few minutes later, my phone buzzed softly in my lap beneath the tablecloth. "Arthur." I opened the message carefully. "Auction link received. I've created a collector account. Don't worry. We'll handle this quietly." I stared at those words for a moment longer than necessary. Quietly. That word mattered. I did not want screaming. I did not want humiliation. I wanted truth. There is a difference. Vanessa suddenly stood again. "I'll be right back," she announced casually. This time nobody even questioned it. I watched her disappear toward the hallway with her phone already unlocked in her hand. Thomas leaned toward me immediately. "She's obsessed with those bids," he whispered. I nodded slowly. "She thinks nobody notices." "What are you going to do?" Before I could answer, my phone vibrated again. Arthur had sent a screenshot. The bid had climbed to nearly $3,000 already, and beneath it appeared a new anonymous bidder name, Silvercrest Collis Bolt Arthur. I stared at the screen, while my heart beat heavily inside my chest. The auction had become something else now, not just a sale. A trap. Vanessa returned moments later wearing a satisfied smile she tried very hard to hide. Daniel noticed it too. "You seem happy," he teased. Gently, she laughed lightly while sitting beside him again. "Maybe I'm just enjoying dinner." But her fingers immediately reached for her phone again under the table. I saw the glow against her sweater. A notification. Another bid. Her eyes lit up instantly. That expression hurt more than anger ever could, because it was excitement, pure excitement. The sapphire brooch was not reminding her of family or history. It was reminding her of profit. Helen began speaking about an old vacation memory, but my attention drifted away from the conversation again. Instead, I studied Vanessa quietly. I remembered the first time Daniel introduced her to us. She arrived carrying expensive flowers and speaking warmly to everyone in the room. She knew exactly how to make people feel comfortable. My husband used to call that polished charm, the kind that appears perfect on the surface because it has been practiced carefully. At first, I truly believed Vanessa loved Daniel deeply. Maybe part of her still did, but somewhere along the way, appearances and money seemed to become more important than anything else. The signs had always been there. I simply ignored them because I wanted peace. That realization brought its own sadness. Sometimes betrayal grows slowly in places where honesty should have spoken sooner. Thomas quietly slid his phone toward me beneath the table again. The bidding war had intensified. 3,400, then $3,800 only moments later. Arthur was pushing carefully. Not enough to scare her, just enough to keep her emotionally invested. I could almost picture him sitting at his desk downtown, glasses low on his nose, calmly placing bids while polishing one of his old pocket watches the way he always did when concentrating. For the first time that evening, the smallest flicker of control returned to me. Vanessa checked the auction again. I watched her shoulders straighten slightly. Then came another smile. Small, greedy, satisfied. Daniel touched her hand gently. Everything okay? She answered quickly. Just checking messages. Messages. Not lies exactly, but not truth either. The room had started feeling warmer from the candles and coffee, yet I felt cold beneath my sweater. I looked toward the sapphire pinned against Vanessa's chest. The stone reflected soft golden candlelight exactly the way it used to reflect firelight when my grandmother wore it decades ago, and suddenly I remembered something Eleanor once told me: jewelry reveals character faster than hardship sometimes. At the time, I never understood what she meant. Now I did. Precious things test people. Not because of beauty, because of temptation. Another notification buzzed from Vanessa's phone. She nearly reached for it before stopping herself when she realized everyone could see. Too late. Thomas noticed. Helen noticed. Even Daniel frowned slightly now. You sure work isn't bothering you tonight? He asked carefully. Vanessa laughed. No, just friends texting. She picked up her coffee cup, but her fingers trembled slightly with excitement, not nervousness, anticipation. The auction was climbing higher than she expected, and somewhere inside her mind, she was probably already spending the money. The realization hollowed me out inside. I wondered if she had ever truly wanted acceptance from this family at all, or if she only wanted access. Arthur's next message arrived 15 minutes later. She keeps checking the listing every 2 minutes. I'm increasing the pressure slowly. Even reading those words made my stomach tighten. Pressure. That was exactly what this evening had become. A silent pressure nobody else at the table fully understood. Yet, dessert plates sat half empty now. The grandchildren had fallen asleep in the living room beneath blankets. Rain continued softly outside while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked louder as the house quieted deeper into night. Vanessa excused herself again. This time Daniel sighed softly after she left. She's been distracted all evening, he murmured. I looked at him carefully. Part of me wanted to tell him everything immediately, but another part knew he needed to see it himself. Not hear it through emotion, see it through truth. Helen glanced toward me quietly. I think she sensed something far deeper than distraction now, but she remained silent. When Vanessa returned again, her cheeks looked slightly flushed. Excitement. Adrenaline. The auction had become real to her. She sat down quickly and reached for her wine. Then her phone buzzed once more. Without thinking, she smiled down at it openly this time. Thomas saw it. Helen saw it, and finally, Daniel saw it too. What's going on? He asked gently, for the first time all evening. Vanessa looked caught off guard. What do you mean? You keep checking your phone. Oh. She laughed nervously. It's nothing important. Daniel studied her face for a moment longer than usual, then slowly nodded, but I could see doubt entering his eyes now. Small, quiet, but present. And once doubt enters a room, it rarely leaves peacefully. My own phone buzzed again. Arthur, final phase. Beginning soon. I swallowed hard. The words felt strangely serious for an online auction, yet somehow appropriate, because this was no longer really about eBay. It was about character being revealed in real time. I looked around the dining room slowly. The candles had burned lower now. Coffee cups sat scattered across the table. Family photographs lined the walls around us like silent witnesses to everything unfolding beneath that roof, and at the center of it all sat Vanessa, smiling at a future she thought she controlled, completely unaware that every bid pulling her deeper into excitement was also pulling her closer to exposure. Then suddenly her phone buzzed sharply again. She looked down, and her eyes widened. The bid had jumped dramatically. Higher than before. Much higher, even from across the table. I saw excitement flash across her face so quickly she could not hide it. For one brief moment, she forgot herself entirely. forgot the family around her, forgot the heirloom pinned to her chest, forgot dignity. All she saw was money. Arthur had done exactly what he promised. He had pulled her fully into the trap, and sitting there beneath candlelight, while rain whispered softly against the windows, I realized something painful but necessary. Some people do not reveal who they are during hard times, they reveal themselves the moment they believe nobody is watching. By the time the clock in the hallway struck 10, the warmth in the dining room had begun to fade. Not physically. The candles still flickered softly across the table. Coffee cups still released thin curls of steam into the air. Rain still tapped gently against the windows as if the world outside knew nothing about the quiet storm growing inside our family. But something had changed. Everyone could feel it now, even if nobody understood it completely yet. The grandchildren were asleep. In the living room beneath folded blankets, Helen sat quietly turning her spoon inside her empty cup. Thomas checked his phone every few minutes while pretending not to. And Vanessa could barely hide her excitement anymore. Every new notification pulled her attention away from the table instantly. Her eyes brightened each time she looked down at the screen. She tried to appear calm, but greed has a rhythm to it. A kind of nervous energy that slowly leaks into every movement. Daniel noticed too. I could see the confusion growing inside him. He kept glancing between Vanessa and the rest of us, sensing tension without understanding its shape. Finally, Vanessa stood from her chair once more. I think I misplaced a brooch, she announced suddenly. The room became still. Her voice sounded carefully controlled, but I noticed a faint tightness underneath it. Daniel looked up immediately. What? The sapphire brooch, she said, touching her sweater dramatically. I think the clasp must have come loose somewhere. I stared at her quietly. The brooch was no longer pinned to her sweater. At some point during the evening, she had removed it completely. Helen frowned. Oh dear, maybe it fell in the hallway? Vanessa nodded quickly. I've been looking everywhere. Looking. The lie settled heavily across the table. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate before speaking. You don't need to look for it anymore. Vanessa froze. Only slightly, but enough. Daniel looked toward me with confusion. What do you mean, Mom? I reached beside my chair calmly and lifted a small envelope from the floor. Arthur had delivered it less than 20 minutes earlier without entering the house. Thomas quietly brought it inside while everyone else remained distracted. Vanessa's face lost color the moment she saw the envelope. My voice remained soft. Because I already know where the brooch is. Silence filled the dining room. Deep silence. The kind that changes people forever. Daniel looked between us slowly. May. Vanessa began carefully. I don't understand. I opened the envelope and removed several printed pages. eBay screenshots, auction numbers, photographs, bid history. Every page slid gently across the table one by one. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Thomas lowered his eyes. Helen covered her mouth softly. Daniel stared down at the papers in complete confusion. Then realization slowly reached his face. No, he whispered. Vanessa immediately shook her head. This isn't what it looks like. Her voice trembled now, not with sadness, with panic. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. The photographs were taken tonight, Vanessa. I can explain. Can you? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Daniel picked up one of the printed pages with shaking hands. The auction listing stared back at him plainly. Vintage sapphire brooch estate jewelry quick sale. I watched heartbreak enter my son's eyes piece by piece. Not sudden, slow, painfully slow. Tell me this isn't yours, he whispered. Vanessa looked toward him desperately. I was only thinking about selling it later. But you listed it tonight, Thomas said quietly. Nobody even noticed him speak until that moment. Vanessa turned sharply toward him. You were spying on me? No. He replied calmly. I was online and saw the listing. Daniel stared at his wife like he no longer recognized her. You sold my family heirloom during dinner? I didn't sell it yet. She snapped suddenly before catching herself. The room became even quieter after that. Because anger had finally replaced performance. Vanessa realized it immediately too. Her expression softened again, trying to recover. I thought maybe we could use the money, she whispered weakly. Daniel looked stunned. For What? She hesitated. The house renovations, bills, investments. I don't know. I finally spoke again. If you needed help, you could have spoken to us. Vanessa's eyes filled with frustrated tears. You don't understand what it's like feeling judged all the time in this family. Helen blinked in surprise. Judged? Yes, Vanessa said, emotion rising now. Everything here is about tradition and history and old memories. Sometimes I feel like I'll never belong no matter what I do. For one brief moment, genuine hurt crossed her face. And honestly, that part may have been true. Families can unintentionally make outsiders feel small sometimes. But pain does not excuse betrayal. I answered gently. Belonging is earned through love, not ownership. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Then Daniel noticed something else on the papers. What's this? He asked quietly. He picked up the final, printed page. Winning bidder confirmation. The auction had ended early, and beside the bidder name sat a familiar business account. Silvercrest Collisbolt. Vanessa frowned immediately. What is that? I folded my hands calmly in my lap. That, I said softly, is the person who bought the brooch. Confusion spread across her face. Then slowly, fear, because she realized something important. The buyer was not a stranger. Arthur stepped quietly into the dining room at that exact moment. No dramatic entrance, no anger, just calm footsteps and tired eyes beneath the soft hallway light. Vanessa went completely pale. Arthur removed his coat slowly. Evening, he said gently. Daniel stared at him in confusion. Arthur? Arthur nodded once before placing a small velvet box carefully onto the table. The same velvet box, the same faded blue fabric, the same family heirloom. Vanessa's breathing became shallow. I don't understand, Daniel whispered. Arthur looked toward him kindly. Your mother called me after the listing appeared online. Daniel slowly turned toward Vanessa again. You actually posted it. Vanessa looked cornered now, trapped between evidence and silence. I made a mistake, she whispered. Arthur's voice remained calm. No, dear. Mistakes happen accidentally. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Outside, rain continued falling softly against the windows while the entire family sat beneath the weight of truth. I looked toward the sapphire resting inside the velvet box. It suddenly looked older somehow, tired, like even objects can carry disappointment. Daniel rubbed one hand across his face slowly. I can't believe this. Vanessa reached for him desperately. Daniel, please. But he quietly pulled his hand away. That small movement hurt more than shouting ever could. Helen wiped tears from her eyes. Thomas stared silently toward the table, and through it all, I felt something unexpected inside myself. Not rage, sadness, deep sadness. Because no matter how this evening ended, the family would never return to what it had been before dinner. Vanessa finally looked toward me directly. May, I really am sorry. I believed part of her meant it. But regret after exposure feels different than regret before action. I answered softly. Do you know what hurts most? Tears slid quietly down her cheeks. I never meant to hurt you. That's exactly the problem, I whispered. You never stopped long enough to think about anyone except yourself. The room remained silent. Then I picked up the sapphire brooch carefully from the velvet box. The stone reflected candlelight once more, glowing softly against the darkness around it. My grandmother carried this brooch through war, I said quietly. My mother protected it through difficult years when we barely had enough money to survive. Every woman before me understood something important. I looked directly at Vanessa. An heirloom is not valuable because of its price. My voice trembled slightly. It is valuable because of the hands that protected it before ours. Vanessa lowered her face into her hands and began crying quietly. Not dramatic crying. Small broken sounds filled with shame. Daniel stared down at the table, completely shattered. Arthur remained silent near the doorway. And outside, the rain continued falling gently over the dark sleeping neighborhood while inside our family dining room, generations of trust sat cracked wide open beneath candlelight. After several long minutes, Daniel finally stood slowly from his chair. I think it's time for us to go. Vanessa looked up at him with red swollen eyes. Daniel, but he could not even look at her fully. He reached for their coats quietly while avoiding everyone's eyes. The grandchildren still slept peacefully in the other room, unaware that something enormous had just changed forever. Before leaving, Daniel paused beside my chair. His voice broke softly. "I'm sorry, Mom." I touched his hand gently. "This isn't your shame to carry." But he looked unconvinced. Vanessa stood near the doorway, trembling silently while holding her purse against her chest. She looked smaller somehow now. The confidence from earlier had disappeared completely. For one brief moment, I almost pitied her. Then I remembered the auction listing. Quick sale. Family history reduced to two careless words. Daniel opened the front door quietly. Cold rain air drifted inside the house. And without another sentence, they walked out into the night together. The door closed softly behind them. No shouting. No slammed doors. Only silence. Heavy. Permanent. I looked down at the sapphire resting in my hands once more. Then very carefully, I placed it back inside the velvet box where it belonged. After Daniel and Vanessa left that night, nobody moved for a long time. The dining room remained frozen in silence while rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Half-empty coffee cups sat untouched beside dessert plates. The candles had burned low now, their flames smaller and weaker than before. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet nothing felt the same anymore. Helen was the first to speak. "Oh, May," she whispered sadly, but I did not know how to answer her. What words exist for moments like that? How do you explain the feeling of watching trust disappear in front of your eyes? Arthur quietly pulled out a chair and sat beside me. His expression carried the same calm sadness I felt inside myself. "You did the right thing," he said gently. I looked down at the velvet box resting near my plate. "It doesn't feel like it. That's because protecting family sometimes hurts." His words stayed with me long after that evening ended. Eventually, Thomas helped clear the table while Helen gathered blankets from the living room where the grandchildren still slept peacefully. None of us spoke much. The house itself seemed quieter somehow, as though even the walls understood something painful had happened there. Before leaving, Arthur rested one hand softly against my shoulder. "Call me tomorrow," he said. "Don't sit alone with this." Then he picked up his coat and disappeared into the rainy night. By midnight, the house was finally empty. I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes slowly while soft piano music still played faintly from the radio. The warm water moved over my hands, but I still felt cold deep inside my chest. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the velvet box sitting safely on the counter, back where it belonged. And yet even that comfort felt incomplete now, because the brooch had returned, but innocence had not. I barely slept that night. The storm outside continued until morning, and sometime around 3 o'clock I found myself sitting alone in the dark living room holding an old photograph of my grandmother, Eleanor Dot, in the picture. She stood outside the same house nearly 60 years earlier, the sapphire brooch pinned proudly near her collar. She looked strong, steady, certain. I wondered what she would say about everything that happened. Part of me feared I had failed her. Somehow, another part understood the truth more clearly now. The failure had not been in protecting the heirloom. The failure had been ignoring warning signs for too long because I wanted harmony more than honesty. Morning arrived slowly. Gray sunlight spilled through the curtains while exhaustion settled heavily into my bones. I made tea and carried it carefully toward the dining room. The chair Vanessa sat in the night before remained slightly pushed back from the table. Such a small detail, yet seeing it made my chest ache again. Around noon, Daniel called. I stared at the phone for several seconds before answering. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded exhausted, older somehow. "Hello, sweetheart." Silence lingered between us. Finally, he spoke again. "She left this morning." I closed my eyes briefly. "Where did she go?" "To her sister's place for a few days." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "I don't even know what to think right now." I held my teacup carefully between both hands. "You don't have to decide everything today." Another long silence followed. Then quietly, almost like a child again, he asked, "How did I not see this?" That question broke my heart more than anything else, Because I had asked myself the same thing all night. She fooled all of us sometimes, I answered softly. Not just you, but you noticed things earlier, didn't you? I hesitated. Yes. Daniel exhaled shakily. I kept making excuses for her, so did I. The truth settled heavily between us. Love can blind people gently. Not all at once. Little by little, until reality becomes uncomfortable to face. Daniel spoke again after a while. She said she only wanted financial security. And did you believe her? Another silence. Then finally, I think she wanted more than we could ever give her. His voice carried no anger now, only sadness. That was the hardest part about Daniel. Even wounded, he still searched for understanding instead of revenge. Before hanging up, he whispered something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. I spent so much time trying to keep peace that I forgot to protect what mattered. After the call ended, I sat quietly staring out the window while rainwater still clung to the garden roses outside. Protect what mattered. Such simple words, and yet so many families failed to do exactly that. A few days later, I visited my lawyer, not because I wanted punishment, because responsibility sometimes requires difficult decisions. For years, my estate plans remained simple and trusting. Family heirlooms would pass naturally through generations the way they always had before. Now I understood the world differently. The sapphire brooch was placed into protected storage along with several other family keepsakes. Legal instructions were updated carefully regarding inheritance and ownership, not from bitterness. From caution, the lawyer, an older gentleman named Mr. Calloway, removed his glasses while reviewing the paperwork. These pieces clearly mean a great deal to you, he said kindly. They're pieces of people, I answered softly. That's what most people forget. He nodded slowly, as though he understood exactly what I meant. When I returned home that afternoon, I found a small envelope resting inside my mailbox. A no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from Vanessa. The paper trembled slightly in my hands while I unfolded it. May, I know saying sorry cannot undo what I did. I don't expect forgiveness right now, but I need you to know that seeing everyone's faces that night made me realize how little I understood about this family. I spent too much time looking at what things were worth instead of why they mattered. I truly am ashamed. Vanessa read the letter 3 times, not because it erased anything, because part of me believed she finally understood the damage she caused. Pain teaches lessons pride refuses to hear. Still, understanding does not repair trust overnight. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the kitchen drawer beside old recipes and unpaid bills. Life has a strange way of storing heartbreak beside ordinary things. Weeks passed quietly after that. Daniel visited more often. Sometimes we sat on the porch without speaking much while evening sunlight faded across the neighborhood. Grief existed between us now, but so did honesty. One evening, he finally asked the question both of us avoided. Do you think people like Vanessa can change? I thought carefully before answering. Yes, I said softly, but only after they stop lying to themselves. Daniel lowered his eyes thoughtfully. I loved her. I know, and part of me still does. That confession carried so much sadness inside it that I reached for his hand immediately. Love does not disappear simply because disappointment arrives. Sometimes that is what makes heartbreak so painful. Months later, Arthur came by the house carrying a small wooden case beneath his arm. Without speaking, he placed it gently onto the dining table. Inside rested the sapphire brooch, polished beautifully, safe again. I thought it deserved a proper return. Home, he said warmly. My eyes filled with tears almost instantly. I lifted the brooch carefully into my hands. The deep blue sapphire still caught the light exactly the same way it always had. Unaffected, untouched, as though it had survived yet another chapter in its long life. Arthur smiled faintly. Funny thing about real heirlooms, he murmured. They outlast human foolishness. I laughed softly through my tears. Then together, we carried the brooch upstairs toward the old cedar chest resting in my bedroom closet. Inside were generations of memories, letters tied with ribbon, black and white photographs, wedding gloves, military medals, and now, once again, the sapphire brooch wrapped carefully in cream-colored cloth, back where it belonged. Before closing the chest, I paused one last moment looking down at it. The sapphire reflected a small beam of afternoon sunlight through the window. Beautiful, steady, enduring, and, standing there in the quiet stillness of my bedroom, I finally understood something my grandmother had tried teaching me all those years ago. Greed may chase value, but only love understands legacy. Weeks passed, though in some ways it felt like much longer. The house had returned to its usual quiet rhythm again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not peaceful the way it used to be, more thoughtful, more careful, as if the walls themselves had learned something they could not forget. Mornings began slowly. I would wake up, make tea, and sit by the kitchen window watching the garden change with the season. The rain had stopped now, replaced by pale sunlight that softened everything it touched. But even in the stillness, my thoughts often drifted back to that night. To the candles. To the silence. To the moment truth finally stepped into the room and refused to leave quietly. Daniel started visiting more often after a few weeks. 81st. He came only for short stays. He would sit at the kitchen table, holding his cup with both hands, saying very little. There was something heavier in his posture now, like he was carrying thoughts he had not yet learned how to put into words. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, he finally spoke. "Mom," he said quietly, "it still doesn't feel real sometimes." I looked at him gently. "What part?" "All of it," he admitted. "The brooch, the listing, Vanessa." He paused, staring down at his hands. "I keep replaying it in my head." I sat beside him. That is what regret does. It does not shout. It replays. "I know," I said softly. He exhaled slowly. "I should have seen it sooner." I shook my head. "No, you saw it when you were ready to see it." That was the truth I had also learned about myself. We do not always miss things because we are careless. Sometimes we miss them because we are hoping they are not true. Daniel looked toward the hallway where the dining room stood. "It feels different here now." "It is different," I replied. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Over time, Daniel began to heal in small ways. Not quickly, not perfectly. Healing rarely follows a straight path. Some days he spoke about Vanessa without emotion. Other days, his voice would tighten slightly when her name came up. I never rushed him through it. Grief takes many forms, and this was one of them. As for Vanessa, she stayed away. There were no dramatic returns, no sudden apologies in person, only distance and silence. Occasionally, a short message would arrive on Daniel's phone. Polite, careful, but always brief. He never deleted them. But he stopped replying after a while. I think part of him needed time to understand what forgiveness even meant in this situation. Forgiveness is not forgetting, and it is not pretending nothing happened. It is deciding what place someone holds in your life after the truth has been fully seen. The sapphire brooch remained safely inside its wooden chest for several weeks. Sometimes I would open the lid just to look at it, not because I was searching for pain, but because I was reminding myself of something important, that objects carry meaning only because people give them meaning. And people must learn to respect that meaning if they want to be trusted with it. One evening, Arthur visited again. He brought a small box of old tools and sat with me in the living room while the sunset painted the walls in soft orange light. He placed the box on the table and smiled faintly. "You know," he said, "I've seen a lot of strange things in my life working with jewelry." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Oh." He nodded. "People fight over diamonds, gold, stones worth fortunes. But the real damage is never about money." I listened quietly. "It's about intention," he continued. "What someone believes they are entitled to take." His words stayed with me long after he left. That night, I sat alone in the dining room again. The same room where everything had unfolded. But now it felt different. The air no longer carried tension, only memory. I looked at the empty chair where Vanessa had once sat smiling, checking her phone, unaware that her decisions were slowly unraveling her place in our family. I no longer felt anger when I thought of her. That surprised me at first, but over time, I realized anger had been replaced by something else: understanding. Not acceptance. Understanding. People do not always show their true values at the beginning. Sometimes they reveal them only when temptation arrives quietly in their hands. The following month, I decided something important. I took the sapphire brooch out of the chest and placed it into a safer display case in my bedroom. Not hidden away, not forgotten, but respected. Every morning when sunlight entered through the curtains, it would touch the sapphire briefly and make it glow softly for a moment. And in those moments, I often thought about Eleanor, my grandmother, the woman who first carried this legacy through difficult times. I wondered what she would think of everything that had happened. And somehow, I felt I already knew the answer. She would not have been angry about the betrayal. She would have been sad, but she would have understood something I was only now learning fully. That family is not defined by perfection. It is defined by what survives after imperfection is revealed. One afternoon, Daniel arrived unexpectedly with a small envelope in his hand. He did not sit down immediately. He simply stood in the doorway for a moment, looking uncertain. "I saw her today," he said quietly. My heart paused slightly. "Oh." He nodded. "We talked." I waited. "She asked about you," he added. I remained silent. "And the brooch?" That part did not surprise me. Daniel finally sat down. "She said she didn't want anything from us anymore," he said slowly. "Just closure." I looked out the window for a moment. Closure is a word people use when they are trying to place distance between themselves and a painful memory. But closure is rarely simple. "It is not my place to give her closure," I said gently. Daniel nodded. "I told her that." Silence followed again. Then he added quietly, "I think she's trying to understand what she lost." I did not respond immediately, because I had learned something important in all of this. Some losses are not about objects, they are about trust. And trust, once broken, does not return in the same shape. It has to be rebuilt differently. If it is rebuilt at all. As the seasons changed again, life slowly settled into a new kind of normal. Not the old one, a new one. The kind that carries memory but does not live inside it. The house felt calmer, stronger in some ways. As if it had absorbed everything and decided to keep standing anyway. On quiet evenings, I sometimes sat alone with a cup of tea and thought about what I would say if I ever told this story aloud to someone. Not to blame, not to shame, but to understand. And I think the lesson would always come back to the same truth. We do not lose things in life only when they are taken from us. Sometimes we lose them the moment we stop recognizing their meaning. The sapphire brooch still rests safely where it belongs, now, not as an object of value, but as a reminder of love that endured, of trust that was tested, and of the quiet strength it takes to protect what truly matters, even when doing so changes everything. As I sit here now, I realize something simple. The house is still the same house, the rain still falls the same way when it comes, the garden still grows, but I am not the same person I was before that dinner. And perhaps that is the final truth of all. Some moments do not just change what we see, they change how we see everything forever.